Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. If you're a regular listener to the show, and if you're not, welcome, you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. You'll know that the usual format is that I speak to my guests about their experience or area of specialism. Last year, I tried something different, and in the spirit of the show, I ran a behavioural experiment. For the 100th episode, I invited back two previous guests, Gerald Ashley and Rory Sutherland, and let them riff off each other. It wasn't an entirely random experiment. Both of them knew each other well, and I'd seen them interact together before. What they delivered was podcast gold. The discussion flowed so well that it ended up being 2 episodes worth of content, the 99th and 100th episodes of this show. There are links to both of those in the show notes. And as we know from behavioural science, if something works well, it's worth trying again. Earlier this year, behavioural science expert and magician Paul Craven came onto the show and was a big hit with listeners. Since he knows Gerald, it gave me an idea. Why not rerun the experiment with Gerald and Paul and see if we could create more, pun intended, magic by bringing the two of them together? I'm delighted to report that it worked. So well, in fact, that we once again recorded enough content for 2 episodes, of which this is the first. So please enjoy Gerald Ashley and Paul Craven on statistics, spreadsheets, and scam artists. Gerald and Paul, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Hello.
Morning.
Listen, it's an absolute pleasure to have both of you here. And the reason I've got you back, and you've both been on as individual guests, and Gerald, you did a great double act with Rory Sutherland that went down really well, was you both know each other, and I thought it'd be great to have your collective wisdom on things. And what fascinates me about both of you is that you've had very sort of similar-ish and very yet different careers. You both worked in financial services, and I wanted to start the conversation by just exploring this idea of experience and whether past performance, as they talk about in financial services, is indicative of future results. Gerald?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. And it actually goes to quite a deep sort of thought about past data. And that's really about whether past data is cyclical in its nature and is repeatable and just keeps coming round and round. Now, some things are very cyclical. I mean, the obvious ones are sort of sunset, sunrise. The whole of human life is kind of organized around a 7-day week, and there's lots of things that are pretty cyclical. There's some things that are not at all, almost completely random, the famous unknown unknowns. And then, of course, we've got this big chasm in the middle of where things are maybe sometimes cyclical or it's a weak form of cyclicality. And this is probably where financial markets lie. So, at certain times of the economy, certain types of stocks tend to do well or not do so well. And so you're in this slippery world, I think, in finance of where at first blush, things look a little obvious. And then the more you actually study and experience markets, you realize, in fact, how things are very unobvious. And that it becomes, I would say, the more you look at it, the more you realize that you don't know very much.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when you think about that quote that's attributed to Mark Twain, I don't think he ever said it, but he said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And when I look at some performance of markets over my career, which dare I say goes back now to the mid-'80s, there are definitely patterns that do seem to rhyme if they don't quite repeat. And why is that? I think it's because human behaviour essentially hasn't changed in that stage. And the point of your question, Christian, was to say, do you learn from mistakes? And I think the answer is, as individuals, we try to, but it's pretty tough. And there's a quote from Sarah Blakely I quite like, which is that making good decisions comes from experience, but experience comes from making bad decisions. So it is kind of cyclical in that nature as well. And goodness me, when I look back on my career, the amount of sort of investment mistakes I've made that have been the same as the previous ones. It's one thing to make a mistake, and that's completely normal and human. It's a question of, do we learn from them? And I'd like to think we do, but I mean, even as someone that's supposedly well versed in the behavioural sciences, I'm as guilty of some of the biases, the heuristics as anybody, and plenty of stories both in the stock market and outside the stock market that show that I fall for the biases I warn other people about.
Yeah, I think there's a trap here as well that you see a lot with commentators who say, oh, this market is just like it was in 2006 or in 1986. And we all know what happened in 2007 and 1987. So there's a crash coming next year. And it's the old game, take the data, torture it enough, and you can create a graph that shows we're in exactly the same pattern before the 1929 crash, and we know what happened then. And I think this is because we sort of almost, deep within us, we like patterns and we like overlaying ideas and giving us a shortcut to a magic answer that is going to solve the future. Whereas in fact, the future is alarmingly random. We can look at sunset and sunrise tables, and there are certain laws of nature. I mean, I don't know, if you were to toss a coin on Mars, I presume the same rules of probability would apply. But when you start fooling around with data, and particularly playing with the y-axis, so you get just the right values, and comparing one year with another, you are getting into a very large cul-de-sac. In fact, you're starting to look like the captain of the ship in the Suez Canal.
But it's fascinating if you look at, say, something like, I don't know, the 1920s, right? And we can draw parallels between, we've got the Spanish flu and COVID, we've got the stock market crashes. And so we look back to those things. And on the one hand, you're quite right, Gerald. We're pegging it back and sort of going, oh, look, it's exactly the same thing happening. And so we draw all these parallels, ignoring, of course, all the multitude of data points that don't make parallels.
Exactly.
So, but that's one thing. On the other hand, we make the same mistakes. So I find it really fascinating that we have these comparators highlighted, but so in a way it's salient to us, and yet the errors we're making are the same thing. And so even if the situation is slightly different, the mistakes we make seem to be very comparable.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think the same in behavioural as well. I mean, there's me standing on stage or doing workshops and hopefully giving examples of things like confirmation bias and why we should always question why we could be wrong. I mean, how many people go up to their boss and say, I've got a really good idea, but let me tell you why it could be wrong. It's kind of, it's career limiting. Yeah. But it's a very sensible mental model to have before you present any idea. And it brings into the whole idea of having things like pre-mortems about an idea. So if you have a strategy or an investment policy, whatever it may be, the idea being, actually, we should consider what happens if it does go wrong. And because we don't want to be completely surprised. We may be surprised or shocked by how events do turn out, or our investment policy does. But let's just look at the possibility they won't turn out as well as we'd like. What can we do about it? And I think one of the issues now, and you mentioned it, is this idea of data. We're all obsessed with data. It's a very, very good thing. It's very useful. There's no doubting about that. Whatever field we're in, whatever profession we're in, investment particularly springs to mind. I think the problem comes when we rely wholly on the data. And one of the reasons I kind of think that, I mean, data for me is more like a sextant. It's not a destination. It helps us get to the right place, but it's not necessarily going to tell us the exact way of doing it. And I do feel there's a lot of belief now, and maybe this is the old person in me speaking, but I think there's a kind of belief amongst the younger generation that data is the answer to everything. And I'd be pretty cautious about that. And I think if I had to kind of give a metaphor for why, I would say that the best sorts of intelligence, and let's call it artificial intelligence if you want, are those combining the best of machines with the best of humans. And why do I say that? Well, I'm quite a keen chess player, and there was a project a few years ago that's ongoing where they would plot the best chess players against the best machines, and very often the machines would win. And you probably remember the Kasparov, Deep Blue, and all that.
Yeah.
Then they just say, well, what would happen about if you put the best players against a combination of the best machines and other players? In other words, man versus man and machine. And to my knowledge, and they call that the centaur, as in the half man, half beast thing. And the centaur chess wins most times, a combination of both. So I don't feel comfortable about relying entirely on call it AI, call it purely the data. I'd like to see some human subjectivity in there as well. The problem comes, of course, is that the human subjectivity may offer some biases within it. So it's by no means perfect, but I just suspect that there's something about human intuition or human instinct that actually adds something that, to my knowledge, the machines can't quite yet do.
Well, I would pick up on that, and I'm going to remain in violent agreement here. I think the issue is that a lot of analysis of data is very linear. It essentially doesn't bounce around in the way the human brain does. We seem to just operate in a slightly different way. It can be very suboptimal. Occasionally you get a hole in one. I think one of the problems, and maybe one of the interesting areas without diving into the desperate topic of statistical theory, is to think about the difference between averages and extremes. So if you think about a normal distribution of whatever it may be, heights of kids in school, there will be a whole lump of kids around a given height, and then there'll be a few who are very tall and there'll be a few who are very short. If you get anybody who's exceptionally tall or exceptionally short, that's suddenly news and is interesting. If you look at the news from a normal distribution point of view, this is evidence I'm not getting out enough during the lockdown. But if you do look at the news, it's all about extremes. It's always about the person who's walked backwards up Everest or has had some remarkable thing happen, either good or bad. But of course, a lot of the real world is stuck somewhere around the average. And our averages are incredibly dangerous things in many ways, but they do at least give you a lump of what is most likely to be happening. And if you're looking at extremes, you are essentially looking at possibly biased information. And that attracts us. We kind of like that. We like things that are unusual or different, which is why people play these games with statistics, with stock market charts and all the rest of it. Nobody ever sends you a stock market chart saying, oh, well, this year is particularly interesting because it's not at all like 1929, not remotely.
But it's, I mean, that looking at extremities makes sense, right, from a behavioural perspective, because you'd be saying, okay, what are the things I need to worry about? Well, those are the unusual things, because the stuff I'm used to and I know, the tribe that I understand, I don't, I get all of that things. What I'm looking for is things that might be a threat or an opportunity. And so you can sort of see the logic of those pieces. The reason it's not news when somebody does something normal is because we all understand and know that. What we're curious about are the things that we don't normally see and that might help us to make better sense of what's going on out there.
Yeah, again, I think this is the right way of thinking. One of the problems about looking at the past and then extrapolating into the future, it does depend on this strong cyclicality. And I think we can see one of the problems with data is the fact it's so easy to analyze now. If we go back 50 years ago, pre-simple databases and sort of spreadsheets and all the rest of it, it was far harder to crunch all these numbers. And the early bits of crunching probably did uncover new information. But I do wonder now, as if we are spending an enormous amount of time mining data to find facts that we think suit our view. To be honest, many times I think we kind of know the answer we're looking for, and then we go and look for the data that proves it.
Yeah, I mean, humans are pattern seeking. It helps them, and it helps them make sense of the world. And obviously, one of the reasons why we are, if not hardwired, certainly pre-wired to have these mental shortcuts is being bombarded by information, whether it's 2 or 3 million years ago in the ancestral environment, or in a modern day 21st century technological world. We have to try and make sense of the world quickly. And it's kind of based on survival. And there's instincts, if you think about it, are the genetic memory of the problems that our ancestors faced.
Yeah.
And that often makes them, by the way, really good, not bad. I mean, too often I think we assume that mental shortcuts are bad things. The idea being that, we must overcome these mental shortcuts. But actually, a lot of work's been done in the behavioural science field. And actually, it challenges some of Kahneman's premises, I think, that says, actually, hang on a second, don't assume that all biases and heuristics are necessarily bad. They're there for very good evolutionary reasons, or a lot of them are.
Yeah, I think that's right, Paul. The name that comes to mind is the German psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer.
Yes, absolutely. If you haven't read his book, it's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just reminds us that actually a lot of our mental shortcuts make sense. It's just that sometimes when you take them out of the environment in which they came to exist, so think about the herd instinct, for example, it's a brilliant evolutionary plan. I mean, it's fantastic. The way to keep your DNA going is to copy what other people are doing. If you think they're successful, or other animals, it may be, mimic them, and then you will do the same with yours, hopefully. That's a great idea, but put that in a modern financial environment, in the stock market, which is an artificial environment, then you've got problems, because just by copying what other people are doing, guess what? You get bubbles, and after bubbles you get busts, and it seems very irrational in that environment, despite making a lot of sense in the original ancestral environment.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there and say, I think the thing about Gigerenzer's work, which is so good, is he makes a virtue of the fact you don't have to be perfect. One of the problems with the machines is they're looking for the optimal solution all the time. And we can trot out a whole heap of thoughts from people, the classic one from Keynes about being it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. I would encourage listeners to take a look at the work of Herbert Simon from the 1950s on something called satisficing. And this is, in fact, that we act in the real world in a way that gives us just about what we need, not necessarily the perfect bullseye or 100% answer. Spreadsheets don't think like that. Your spreadsheet never gives you an answer that says 2 + 2 is kind of round about 4-ish. There's no ish in a spreadsheet. And I think, again, the ish element is where the human bit comes in, and some people will be better at making good decisions and some will be dreadful. Unfortunately, the dreadful ones aren't uniformly bad, because then obviously they'd have great informational value because you just do the exact opposite. So I think the term may have come up already, but heuristics or rules of thumb are a good way. And again, just to widen everybody's knowledge of unimportant facts, I will just sum it up. Let me see if I can find him here. Sir Francis Buller, who in 1782 was a judge, who is attributed to have come up with the phrase a rule of thumb on the basis of a court case that if you hit your wife with a stick that's no thicker than a thumb, there's no offence. Well, that may well be apocryphal and certainly not a very correct idea. But this general thought of being generally right, kind of being just the right side of good most of the time, is actually what keeps us going, not trying to smack the ball out of the stadium.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned the spreadsheets, and there's a phrase I always like, the tyranny of the spreadsheet, the idea being that a lot of businesses are bound by this idea that there must be a certain spreadsheet with a certain cell filled in with a number as large as possible, which then becomes part of another spreadsheet that goes up to the boss above. And essentially everyone's basically just looking at that cell in the spreadsheet and thinking that's what it's all about. And there's in fact, Rory Sutherland tells one of his great examples amongst millions he has about, you can't just put everything down to cost efficiency, for example. And one example he cites is the idea of having a doorman outside an apartment. Now, it would be very easy for someone to go and say, look, we don't need a doorman anymore. We can save ourselves, £35,000-40,000 or dollars a year. We'll just get something in with a sort of security keypad. and we'll save ourselves all that money. But of course, what that doesn't take into account is all the intangibles that relate to having a doorman, someone who can hold the door open for you, someone who can give you a greeting, a smile in the morning, come on and help you with all your bags. Now, a combination lock on the door can't do those things, but it in the spreadsheet, the combination lock looks better, and yet there are so many intangibles. And it reminds me of a wonderful phrase from William Bruce Cameron, who said, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts."
Yeah.
And I think that's a wonderful way of just looking at this issue of the tyranny of the spreadsheet and saying, what matters more? Does it just come down to some sort of number in a spreadsheet, or is there intangibles that are actually worth so much more, but you can't quite quantify them in a way that fits nicely onto the COO's deck of reporting papers on a Monday morning?
I must say I'm taken by Paul's career advice here. 35 grand as a doorman slightly appeals to me, actually. It doesn't sound a bad idea. Loads of people have written on this stuff, and there's loads of stuff out there to kind of research. A couple of people I would direct listeners to. One is a guy called Tailor Vegan. He's got a most wonderful book and website on spurious correlations. There are a number of favourite ones. Again, listeners can easily look these up, but I love the chart that shows an absolutely very tight correlation between the amount of cheese consumed in the United States versus the number of people who are strangled to death by their bed sheets. And this again is if you take discrete amounts of data and you kind of play with it and fit it. It may be this data is from genuine sources, but you have to find the right window or horizon of data to look at. You can fit anything to anything. And this is where I think we do drift into the area of con men and con artists, because they are extremely skilled, I think, having sort of read about a few. They're not just chancers. They're extremely skilled in understanding our weaknesses around those sort of areas. And I know, to coin a phrase, that Mr. Craven has a certain amount of magic up his sleeve in his career. But in a sense, Paul, aren't you really just a con man?
Well, I'll just defend the art of magic if I can have a go. Magic is an honest contract between magician and audience that says, I'm going to try and fool you. I hope you enjoy it as I try and fool you. And here's my show.
Sounds like you've got your lawyer to prepare that sentence.
No, but in contrast, a con man is never telling you that on the honesty behind it. And I think that's the big difference. And it's fascinating because to me, I've talked about this previously in my last podcast with Christian. I think one of the reasons why I'm so interested in behavioural science and indeed magic is because there are aspects of both that interest me. So not least, for example, how the mind does and doesn't always work, and how you can fool the mind pretty easily. And again, going back to, I think, the first question that Christian asked us about mistakes and experience, how do I get fooled? Well, first of all, if I watch a good magician now, despite having a pretty good knowledge of magic, I love being fooled. And again, in the honest contract that we have between us. And I do sit back and enjoy it. There's someone joked once, there are two sorts of audiences who watch magicians. There are thinking audiences and there are drinking audiences. And I kind of like that. But the more seriously, it is interesting to me to watch anybody who's a master of their craft perform that craft. But have I made mistakes based on experience, despite the fact I know I shouldn't? Yes, I certainly have. And I'll give you a little example. And it's about a dozen years ago. I went with a couple of friends to run in the Paris half marathon, and we got the Gare du Nord and with our wives, and the wives went off to the hotel to check in, and the three of us had to go off to go and register at the place where we would be starting. So we needed to buy a metro ticket, and we wanted one that we could use over the whole weekend. And someone said we need a carnet and this kind of things. and we wanted to buy it. So we went down to the Metro, and there was a big queue outside all the machines there. There's a big queue lining up waiting for the office, and a very nice chap in a uniform and a nice peak cap and a lanyard and everything came on the machine around his thing. Can I help you, gentlemen? You seem to be lost. Well, he said, we're looking to buy some tickets for the weekend to use the Metro all weekend. And he said, well, he said, you can queue there or we can queue for the machines. He said, but there's a machine around the corner, which most people don't know about, which if we go around there, I can help you get your tickets. So we thought that was jolly nice. So we went around with him and he showed us where the machine was, and sure enough, it was on its own. And he said, put in the card what you want. And he said, let me help you. And he took one of the guy's credit cards and put it in there and said, what do you want? You want 3 of these? Fine. And it didn't work. And he took the card out and gave it back to the guy and said, look, it's not working. And he said, I don't know why. I don't know whether it's because you're English or something. I have no idea. But anyway, you better go back and queue around the other side, back in the main things. And he said, oh, but hang on a second. He said, I can use mine and you can pay me back. So sure enough, we were nodding away. We were talking about the football. He claimed to be a Paris Saint-Germain supporter and LA Bleu, and we were laughing away with him and joking. And he, sure enough, put his credit card in and gave us the 3 tickets and said that would be €50 each. And we actually didn't. He said it was €47 each. I remember it well. And of course, we had 50s in our cash. We all give him a tip. He's been so nice and so helpful. We gave him €150 between the 3 of us. And we walked away happy with our tickets and went into the tube and went out to go and register where we had to go and run our race the following day. The problem came when we tried to come back because our tickets didn't go into the machine, and we irritated. These were supposed to last the whole weekend. And and I should say at this point, the 3 of us, we had a senior member from the city who was working for a major asset manager. That was me. We had the head of an advertising agency, and we had the head of a marketing firm. He worked for very, very senior member of a drinks firm, drinks marketing. And so hopefully 3 people who were not stupid, who had seen enough of life and business to know what they were doing. So we came to put our tickets to go back into the centre of Paris, and they didn't work. And so we went to the office and said, look, why don't our tickets work? Why don't they let us through the gate? And the woman looked at the 3 tickets that we had and said, these are children's single tickets. And it just dawned on us, we had been completely conned, right? This man back at the Garden had a uniform on and was friendly and was helpful and was going to save us some time. We accepted it. Now, with anybody listening to this story is going to think, what an idiot. And by the way, you're right to think that, because we were. But I promise you, if I'd heard this story, I thought, it's not possible. But we were just taken in on this little journey of deception. And he sold us 3 children's single tickets, which I think cost about €1.50 each or something, and made 150 basically. And the 2 guys I was with were furious. And I just started laughing, saying, this is the most extraordinarily brilliant example of how, our human biases cause us to make mistakes. He had kind of the authority figure. He had the helmet. It was the need to sort of communicate. He was being very helpful, and reciprocity. And we were joking about the football, LA Bleu. And so it was just a perfect con. And do I feel stupid that I was conned? Yes, I do. But do I regret it? Funny enough, all these years later, no, I don't. Because it's a true story that reminds me that we're all human and we all make the same mistakes. So that is the difference, I think, with a con man and a magician, Gerald.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely great. I think there's another element to con men in that there comes a point where you may be suspicious that you might be being conned, which is a sort of stage on from what happened to you, Paul. But you so bought into the story, you convince yourself there's nothing wrong. And effortlessly segueing to a quote from Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John LeCarre, there's a lovely little exchange between 2 of the spy masters. Smiley says to his junior, Toby Esterhazy, ever bought a fake picture, Toby? And Toby says, I've sold a couple once. And Smiley replies, the more you pay for it, the less inclined you are to doubt its authenticity. So I think, this is where we start getting fraud in art. And there was that American gentleman who managed to sell, no, it was a French guy who managed to sell the Eiffel Tower twice to two separate sets of American scrap metal merchants. I mean, brilliant. And of course, the numbers are very big. And in a funny way, I think this conversation rolls back to the start, because what we've been talking about here is, are we viewing information or data, if you like, in its true context? Because in your situation, Paul, the context seemed quite, it was nicely made sense. There was nothing that looked suspicious or looked strange about it. I think failed cons happen when people pitch it at the wrong level. So if I said to you, I can sell you the Eiffel Tower for 10,000 euros, it kind of feels wrong. Whereas if it was 10 million euros, scrap value or something, it sounds more plausible. So there's a plausibility test, I think, that's important in all this as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we're exchanging quotes, there's a lot of confirmation bias. We unconsciously wanted it all to be true, that particular thing. So that's pure confirmation bias. And all the data we were taking in made sense to us. And we were probably filtering out the bits that didn't make sense, like why wasn't this guy, did he never showed us any ID, or he never, we ignored all that, and he was friendly and talking about the footy and stuff. And so my favourite line from popular music in terms of behavioural science is from Simon & Garfunkel, from the song The Boxer. And the line is, still a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. Yeah,
no, it's very true. The other thing, I think authority figures are very important. Again, I'm not on any bonus of commission here recommending books, but another one to recommend to people or an author is the fascinating story of Frank Abagnale, who was an American con man. In fact, it was made into a film.
Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah, Catch Me If You Can, exactly. And he basically wound up on the flight deck of Pan Am commercial flights. I think he was barely 20. Through the simple expedient, this is in the 1960s, and one hopes security is a little bit tighter these days, by sticking on a Pan Am uniform, and nobody questioned the uniform. And I do wonder how, even in today's so security conscious world, if you just stick a white coat on and a stethoscope, what damage you could do inside a hospital. Because we reference the white coat and the stethoscope with authority, and it's in the right place. Guys, you don't wear a white coat and a stethoscope. You're trying to get on the flight deck of a 747.
Hi, it's Christian here, and I'm just going to jump in before Paul tells a really nice anecdote. If you're not familiar with London, the references he makes might not be entirely clear. So let me explain. The location that he's about to talk about, Smithfield Market, is London's central meat market, which has been at that location for over 1,000 years. That explains why, firstly, there are some unusual laws in place in that part of town, and secondly, the reference he makes to blood. With that said, on with the story.
So there's a nice anecdote about that, which who was it to? I can't remember. I think Richard Littlejohn talks about it in his book. He was a journalist. He used to work near Smithfield Market, and for anybody who works in the city knows, certainly in the old days, I don't know if it's still true, but when Smithfield Market is going, obviously they finish their shifts at 6 a.m. And so I think the pubs in the area around Smithfield had a special license to open very early.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
For the people that work in Smithfield. And the joke amongst some doctor friends at St Thomas's was that all they had to do was go out wearing a white coat, a bit spattered with blood, and
yes.
they get a pint of Guinness at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then apparently, according to Littlejohn, the journalists started copying that and also wearing white coats and putting some tomato ketchup on it, as if they would just come out the Smithfield and got their drinks earlier. Now, I have no idea if that's true or not, but it's a wonderful story. But it makes a serious point, though, doesn't it, about this white coat and what it symbolises, what it represents.
Exactly.
And it could be a doctor, obviously, in one sense. And again, the uniform is very, very powerful. If you think about it, when we see, I mean, that's why you have uniforms. A suit is a uniform. Whisper it quietly, but wearing jeans is a form of uniform, albeit for a certain demographic.
Yeah, I like hipsters who think they're very different, and then they all have the same beard and black polo neck sweater. And say, well, I'm alternative. No, you're not. This comes back to averages versus extremes. So if we can mentally think of the normal distribution curve, if you want to be noticed, be an extreme. If you don't want to be noticed or hide in the crowd or slip through unnoticed, become Mr. or Miss Average. Just slip into the crowd. And I think some people are naturally good at that. Probably nearly all the people you have on this podcast will be dreadful at it. We're probably certainly more extreme personalities than average people. But putting that white coat on just gives the fit that you sit somewhere in the middle. If you wandered through a hospital dressed like Marilyn Manson, you're going to look a bit extreme and you're going to be noticed. And of course, a lot of today's world is about trying to be noticed. Everybody feels they're different. I haven't met a person on the planet who doesn't think they're creative. Everybody thinks they're creative. I think that's far too much like hard work. I prefer to rip off other people's ideas. But, so this thing of averages versus extremes, once you start to see the world in those terms, I think that may help in how you address making decisions.
Gerald, you know this because I said it to you, but it was only about 2 or 3 days ago. There was a well-known commentator on Twitter who was talking about the COVID and how you should ease the lockdown. And he announced categorically you shouldn't ease the lockdown until all the areas of infection are below average.
Yes.
It just think about that. It's and by the way, so many people commented on it as a good idea, and they just didn't think what the word average meant a bit.
No, I think actually exactly right. And I think this business of being able to somehow stand back from the slam dunk bit of data in the spreadsheet that gives you the answer is a powerful thing to be able to question that. And of course, as you said earlier, Paul, we like patterns and we're pattern hunting machines. We also want a quick solution. Don't matter if it's right or wrong. Give me a solution. If it's come from a guy who's got a PhD in creating solutions, it must be even better because that's what he does all day. And hey, if it's in a spreadsheet and its accuracy is to 9 decimal places, who in the world is going to question that? And every time you get a solution, you should ask yourself, what are the assumptions that are underpinning that particular solution or desired place to be? And we don't think like that. We think, well, here's a boffin who's spent years doing maths and statistical analysis and all the rest of it. It must be the right answer. That is incredibly dangerous, I think.
And it's really interesting. So I sit on an advisory board, and actually the CEO was showing us kind of the forecast for different revenue streams. And he said, do you think these forecasts look reasonable? My gut reaction was, that's a ridiculous question, right? Because I haven't seen the underlying. I need to see the spreadsheets. And actually, that wasn't his question at all. His question was just, can you just sense check this, right? I don't need people to pore over the numbers. What I'd like you to do is to challenge me about the assumptions, the thinking around it. And I went from thinking this is a really bad question to actually this is really smart for precisely those reasons.
Yeah, I think another thing is when you question experts, I don't know who this comes from. It may even come from Paul or possibly Rory, but the idea that when you go to see a doctor and you ask, you've got an illness or you don't feel well or whatever it may be, you ask for his opinion. That is the standard thing to do. You go in and say, my head's turned orange. What do you think it might be? And what can you do about it? Now, it may be that a much better question is to say, if you had my condition, what would you do about it? And funnily enough, I think experts often give a slightly different answer. It may be a more because you're making it more personal to the person who's giving the opinion, they may actually almost subliminally give a better answer. So the next time anybody goes to the doctor, and let them diagnose what's wrong with you and all the rest of it, and then ask them a question. If you had this or you were in my shoes, what would you do? And I think that's a much more powerful angle, actually.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I think it was actually Taleb that talks about that.
Right.
And it works, by the way. I've actually done it. I'll give you a small, minor example. Last week, I had to go and see the doctor, and it was one of those ones where you get listed. There's a few spaces and a few doctors are available to see you. And the receptionist read out a list of about 5 or 6 doctors' names. Who do you want to see? Now, I didn't know any of them from any others, and I sort of it was quite a conversation. We had established a good relationship, good rapport over the phone. And eventually I said, look, I can ask you a question. I don't know any of these doctors. I know you can't recommend any, but who would you go and see if it was you?
Yeah, exactly.
And I took her advice. Well, I took what she said and said, well, I'd like to see him then. And I was very pleased I did. He was superb. And then just going back to something you said a little bit earlier about solutions and people looking for solutions. This is actually very interesting because as a magician and as someone that has worked in the city for over 30 years, I'm aware that I think that intelligent people sometimes look for the more complex answers.
Yeah.
They almost want to accept a more complex answer. And there's one of the most wonderful magicians of the 20th century, a guy called Fred Capps, who actually said intelligent people are the easiest to fool. They are always looking for a complicated solution. And I think that's very true. And there's something I'd like to ask anybody who can help me with this, because I'm trying to do some research on something that I've dug out, but there's not much I can find on the internet. But I'm hoping there's someone listening to this program who can help me. And if so, please get in touch and give me some information on I think it was a professor called Bavelas, Bavelas. And there's a thing called the Bavelas experiment, of which there's a little written about I can find. But I'm obviously not access to some of the psychological papers that may be offline, if you like. And the Bavelas experiment, and I can vaguely remember how it went. Essentially, there would be 2 people looking at a screen, and they had to solve some sort of problem. And what happened was it was fairly random. But when they went away to talk about how they'd done in the break, the person who'd got more things right, and in this question, was persuaded by the one who got more things wrong, because the person who got more things wrong had come up with a more complicated reason why he or she had come up with the answers they had, which is extraordinary. So I'm sure. So if anyone can help me with the Bavelas experiment, I'd love to know more about it, because again, it would be consistent with that Fred Capps comment, and consistent with where I've seen lots of meetings in boardrooms in the city, where it does tend to be that people do tend to want to favour a more complicated solution. And again, there may be perfectly natural human reasons for it. I'm sure there are, but it does seem slightly irrational.
It may be we put a value on the effort that's gone into it. So in a way, it's an authority thing, isn't it, Paul? Because if something's sort of in a formal document, it seems more important than if it's just a handwritten note. If something has gone through some sort of program or algorithm, again, it gets given maybe a misplaced sense of authority, and people buy into that. And then there's the intellectual bit, isn't it, where, we've come up with this answer, and I think a lot of people, I certainly was saying, I don't understand how they did that, but that sounds interesting. It's much more interesting than the other guy who's come up with a simple way of doing it, and which works. I don't know how they counter this in something like high-end engineering. My business partner is now retired, but he was in aeronautic engine design, and it's a lot of curly brackets and heavy-duty maths. But there is still a little bit of heuristic in it. There's still not so much rule of thumb. I don't want to alarm anybody who's flying. Don't worry, it's not. The engines are not purely by rule of thumb, but there is still a little bit of looseness in the maths, which maybe allows for intuition or whatever. And yeah, a fascinating idea that we almost reject the simple in favour of the complicated.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, there's obviously aspects of the tyranny of the spreadsheet in there as well, because something that's presented as in that format looks more impressive than someone just telling you something. I've always thought people certainly accept spreadsheets as being sort of near sort of to gospel truth.
Category errors as well, aren't there? How we look at things, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. I think also there's aspects in the whole spreadsheet tyranny that suggest there are ways that people ought to behave or work or whatever. And, it's very easy to come up with a long treatise on, and I guess this comes back to Kahneman's point that economists think about what people ought to do and psychologists watch what they actually do. And there's a big difference between the sort of the theory and the practice, if you like.
I think that's the perfect moment at which to pause this discussion between Gerald and Paul. We'll pick it up in the next episode of the Human Risk podcast. My huge thanks to both of them for appearing and providing such amazing insights. To make sure that you don't miss out on that second half of the discussion, make sure you're subscribed to the show. You'll find it on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you're enjoying the show and haven't yet left a 5-star rating for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients, visit human-risk.com. There are plenty of resources there that'll help you to better understand human decision-making as a risk. I'll be back, as will Paul and Gerald, in the next episode of the show. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.